The laughter started before she even touched the ground. Hank Briggs, foreman of Iron Ridge Ranch, a man who wore his cruelty the way other men wore their hats, naturally and without a second thought, leaned against the post of the stagecoach stop and let out a long, slow whistle that had nothing to do with admiration. He elbowed the man beside him, then the man beside that one, and within seconds the row of ranch hands had arranged themselves into something that looked less like a welcoming party and more like a jury that had already reached its verdict. "Lord have mercy," Hank said, loud enough for everyone to hear, loud enough for her to hear. "Caleb ordered a bride and they sent him a whole barrel." The men laughed, hard. And Abigail Mercer, 31 years old, 5 days out of Texas, carrying everything she owned in 2 battered trunks, stood at the top of the stagecoach steps and heard every single word. She didn't flinch. She didn't cry. She gripped the handrail, took one careful step down, then another, and when her boots finally met Montana soil for the first time, she looked at Hank Briggs with eyes that were steadier than anything he'd expected and said nothing at all. If that were you standing there, what would you do? That question is going to follow you through everything you're about to watch unfold. Because what Abigail did next, what she chose day after day, in a place that had already decided it didn't want her, is the kind of story that doesn't announce itself. It just quietly changes everything around it. Before we go any further, if you've never been here before, welcome. Hit that subscribe button right now and turn on your notifications, because the stories we tell on this channel are the kind that stay with you. And when you're done watching, drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go back to Iron Ridge Ranch, the summer of 1884, and a woman nobody saw coming. The stagecoach had been 3 days late out of Billings, which meant Abigail had spent an extra 3 days sitting in a boarding house room that smelled like mildew and old tobacco, staring at the letter she'd read so many times the creases had gone soft. Mr. Caleb Rowan, Iron Ridge Ranch, Cascade County, Montana Territory. Widower. 1 son, age 7. Seeking a woman of practical disposition and steady character. Correspondence preferred before arrangement is finalized. She had written him 4 letters. He had written her 2. The first was polite and careful, the kind of letter a man writes when he's been told by his bank and his foreman and probably his dead wife's sister that he needs help, and he's not happy about needing it. The second letter was shorter. It said, "I have been honest about our situation. The ranch is not prospering. My son is difficult. I will not pretend otherwise. If you still wish to come, I will meet the stage." He had not met the stage. Hank Briggs had met the stage instead, which told Abigail something she filed away quietly and didn't react to. She had expected the isolation. Caleb's letters had described it plainly enough. Iron Ridge sat 40 minutes by horse from the nearest town, surrounded by open range land and the kind of sky that could make a person feel very small, very fast. What she hadn't quite prepared for was the particular quality of the silence between the ranch hands after the laughter died down. It wasn't embarrassed silence. It was waiting silence. They were waiting to see if she'd cry or argue or get back on the stage. She did none of those things. She turned to the driver, a weathered man named Pete, who had spoken to her exactly twice in 5 days, both times to tell her they were stopping, and she said, "Which of these men will help me with my trunks?" Pete looked at the ground. He'd driven enough mail-order brides to know how this kind of arrival could go, and he'd heard what Hank said, and he was the particular kind of man who felt bad about things, but not bad enough to do anything about them. Hank answered before Pete could. "We ain't bellhops, ma'am." "I didn't ask if you were," Abigail said. "I asked which one of you would help me." The silence shifted. Not much, just enough. A young hand near the back, couldn't have been more than 19, still growing into his own boots, stepped forward without looking at Hank. "I'll get him, ma'am." His name was Danny Pruitt, and he would later say, when people asked him about that day, that he still wasn't sure what made him step forward. He wasn't a particularly brave kid. He said it felt less like a decision and more like the only logical thing to do, given the way she'd asked. Abigail thanked him by name. She'd get his name before they reached the house, and she followed Hank Briggs toward the ranch without speaking another word to the men who'd laughed. Not because she was proud, because she understood, with the particular intelligence of someone who had survived being underestimated her entire life, that arguing with a man like Hank Briggs in the first 5 minutes was exactly what he wanted. He wanted her rattled, He wanted her loud and defensive and emotional, so he could turn to the others and confirm what they already believed. That this woman was a mistake, a burden, a problem Caleb had imported from Texas. She would not give him that. The ranch house was larger than she'd expected and emptier than she'd feared. That particular combination, too much space, not enough warmth, told her everything Caleb's letters had tried to say without quite saying it. A house that size, with that many rooms, should have had noise in it. Children running, someone calling from the kitchen, a dog scratching at the back door. Instead, it had the muffled, held-breath quiet of a place that had been grieving for a long time and hadn't figured out how to stop. Caleb Rowan was standing in the front room when she came through the door. He was taller than she'd imagined, broader, with the kind of face that had once been open and had spent the last few years learning to close itself down. He looked at her the way a man looks at a problem he's been given no good solution to. Not unkindly, but not warmly either. Somewhere in between, in that difficult space where honesty lives. "Miss Mercer," he said. "Mr. Rowan," she said. They shook hands. It was the most awkward handshake Abigail had ever experienced, and she had once shaken hands with a man who was holding a live chicken with his other arm. "I sent Hank to meet the stage," Caleb said. "I had a situation with the north fence line." "I know," she said. "He introduced himself." Something moved behind Caleb's eyes. Not quite guilt, more like the look of a man who knows what Hank is and has chosen to manage rather than confront it, and is now being quietly reminded of what that choice costs other people. "He say something to you?" "He said several things," Abigail said. "Nothing I haven't heard before." That landed differently than she meant it to, or maybe exactly as she meant it to. Caleb looked at her for a moment longer than was comfortable, and then he looked away. "I'll show you where you'll be staying," he said, until the arrangements are finalized." "That's fine," she said. Neither of them mentioned what the arrangements being finalized meant. It hung in the air between them like a thing neither party was ready to name. They weren't married yet. They had agreed, in letter form, to meet and assess the situation and proceed if both parties found it agreeable, which was a very polite way of saying, "We are strangers who have agreed to potentially spend our lives together, and we are both terrified, and neither of us will admit it." The bedroom they gave her was at the back of the house, small and clean, with a window that looked out over the eastern pasture. Someone had put a pitcher of water on the dresser and a bar of soap that was drier than it should have been, which meant it had been sitting there for a while, which meant someone had been planning this longer than Caleb had let on in his letters. She sat on the edge of the bed and let herself be still for a moment. Just one moment. She allowed herself to feel the full weight of where she was and how far she'd come, and how thoroughly the first 10 minutes had gone. She felt it, which was different from showing it, and that difference was something she'd learned young. Her mother used to say, "Feel everything, Abby, just don't let everything feel you back." Then she stood up, unpacked her first trunk with efficient hands, and went to find the kitchen. It wasn't hard to find. She followed the smell, which was a combination of something burnt and something unwashed, and a third thing she couldn't quite identify, but suspected was old grease that had been sitting too long. She pushed open the kitchen door and found a man named Walt. Walt was 63 years old, had been cooking for Iron Ridge Ranch for 11 years, and was currently sitting on a stool with his right hand pressed flat against his lower back, with the particular expression of someone who is in chronic pain and has learned to accept it the way some men accept bad weather. He looked up when she came in. He didn't look welcoming. He didn't look hostile. He looked tired in the way that went deeper than sleep could fix. "You're the woman from Texas," he said. "I am," she said. "Abigail Mercer." "Are you Walt?" He blinked. "How'd you know my name?" "The kid who carried my trunks told me," she said. "Danny." He said Walt's the one who runs the kitchen. He said it like it mattered. Walt looked at her for a long moment. "Danny's a good kid," he said finally. "He seems like it," she said. Then, "What's hurting you?" "My back." "How long?" 2-3 years. "Does it get worse when you're on your feet for a long time?" He gave her a look that was equal parts suspicious and curious. "Why?" "Because if it does," she said, looking around the kitchen with the specific attention of someone cataloging problems rather than criticizing them, "there are some things in here we can rearrange so you don't have to move as much when you're working. It won't fix it, but it might make a full day less expensive." Walt stared at her. I'm not going to come in here and push you out, she said. I want to be clear about that. This is your kitchen. I'd just like to understand how it works. Another long pause. Then Walt shifted on his stool and said, in the voice of a man making a reluctant concession, the flour's in the wrong place. Has been for years. Every time I need it, I have to cross the whole room. My back gives out right around flour time. Where should it be? He pointed. All right, she said, we'll move it. They moved it together, that afternoon, Walt directing from his stool and Abigail shifting the heavy sack and two smaller tins without making a production of the effort. It was a small thing, profoundly small. The kind of thing that takes 10 minutes and changes nothing dramatic and changes everything that matters. She didn't see Caleb again until dinner. She didn't see Noah at all. Dinner that first night was a testing moment in ways she understood and others she didn't yet. The ranch hands ate at a long table in the cookhouse attached to the main structure. 12 men, varying ages, varying degrees of the attitude she'd seen at the stagecoach stop. Hank Briggs sat at the far end and watched her with the particular attention of a man deciding how long it would take to make her leave. She'd asked Walt what they usually had for dinner on a Tuesday. He'd told her. Salt pork, boiled beans, cornbread if there was time. She'd looked at what was available in the stores and spent 45 minutes in the kitchen producing something different with what should have been the same ingredients. Pork that had been rendered down slower, beans with onion and dried herb she'd found in a tin at the back of a shelf, cornbread that was, and this was important, not burnt. She didn't carry it out herself. She helped Walt carry it because it was heavy and because she didn't want to make an entrance. She set things on the table and stepped back. The men ate. She watched. The first change in the room was subtle. A man halfway down the table, older, gray-bearded, stopped chewing and looked at his plate. Then he kept eating, faster. Then the man next to him did the same thing. Then a third. Hank Briggs ate slowly, deliberately, without expression. He was the kind of man who would rather have something be bad than admit it was good. But even Hank Briggs cleaned his plate. Abigail noticed. She said nothing. She went back to the kitchen and helped Walt with the washing up. And when Walt said quietly, without looking at her, "They ain't eaten like that in a while," she just nodded. "Good to know," she said. Caleb found her after dinner, standing at the edge of the back porch, looking out at the darkening pasture. He stood beside her without speaking for a moment, and she let the silence sit. "Walt said you rearranged the kitchen," he said finally. "Moved some things," she said. "His back makes the crossing difficult." "Walt's been managing." "He has," she said. "He's been managing the way people manage when they've stopped expecting anything better." She paused. "That's not a criticism of you or him. It's just what I saw." Caleb was quiet for a long time, long enough that she wondered if she'd gone too far, too fast. She had a habit of saying true things in ways people weren't quite ready to receive them, and she knew it, and she was still learning when to wait. "Noah didn't come to dinner," he said finally. "I know." "He won't. He's been difficult since his mother died. That was 2 years ago. He doesn't warm to people easily." "He doesn't have to warm to me easily," she said. "I'm not in a hurry." Caleb turned and looked at her then, with the first fully direct look he'd given her since she'd arrived. Like he was trying to figure out if she meant that, or if it was the kind of thing a person says to seem patient. Whatever he found in her face seemed to settle something in him. Not a lot, just a degree. "I want to be honest with you," he said. "This ranch, it's not what it was. My wife, Clara, she had a way of keeping things together I didn't understand until she was gone. The men are what they are. And I'm not sure I made the right call bringing someone out here into this." "You didn't bring me," Abigail said. "I came. There's a difference." He looked at her again. "I read your second letter 11 times, she said. "The one where you told me it was hard, and the boy was difficult, and things weren't prospering. I read it 11 times, and then I packed my trunks." She looked back out at the pasture. "I'm not here because I was desperate and had nowhere else. I'm here because that letter was honest, and I thought someone who writes honest letters might be worth the trouble." Caleb Rowan, who had not felt seen by another person in 2 full years, stood very still. "I appreciate you saying that," he said. "It's just true," she said. They stood in the dark for a few more minutes, not quite strangers anymore, not yet anything else, and then they went inside. Somewhere in the house, behind a closed door, A 7-year-old boy lay awake listening to footsteps he didn't recognize yet, in a house that didn't feel like home anymore, waiting for something he couldn't name. The next morning, Abigail woke before dawn. This was not unusual for her. She had spent most of her adult life waking before things began, because waking before things began meant she had time to see them clearly before anyone else arrived with their expectations and their opinions and their versions of what she should be doing. Morning was the only time of day that was entirely hers. She went to the kitchen. Walt wasn't up yet. She started the stove herself, got water heating, and stood in the half-dark learning the room. She had already identified 5 things the day before that she would address in time, and 3 things she would leave alone because they worked even if they didn't look like it, and 2 things she had questions about that she'd ask Walt when he came in. What she didn't expect was the sound behind her, small feet, careful, deliberate, trying not to make noise and making it anyway the way small people always do. She didn't turn around. She kept her hands on the work in front of her. "There's milk in the blue pitcher," she said. "If you're thirsty, I didn't drink any of it." Silence. "I'm not going to make you talk to me," she said. "I just wanted you to know it was there." More silence. Then the sound of the blue pitcher being lifted from the shelf. The sound of milk being poured. The sound of someone drinking quickly, guiltily, like a person caught doing something they weren't sure they were allowed to do. Then small feet retreating back up the stairs. She turned around only after she heard the floorboard at the top of the landing creak under his weight. The glass was sitting on the shelf. He'd put it back. Washed it too, with the little bit of water in the basin. She looked at that clean glass for a long moment. He's careful, she thought. Careful and proud and frightened. All at once. She already loved him a little, which surprised her. She hadn't expected that to happen so fast. It complicated things, because love before trust is a precarious position, and she was already in enough precarious positions to be going on with. But there it was. By the end of the first week, 3 things had changed at Iron Ridge Ranch. The food was different. Not dramatically, not with expensive ingredients or elaborate preparation. Walt still ran the kitchen, still made the decisions on quantities, still knew the stores and the schedules. But the way things were cooked had shifted by degrees, and those degrees added up to a meal that men came back from, not just fed, but actually restored, the way food is supposed to work, and so rarely does when it's made without attention. The second thing that changed was Walt's back. Not healed, nothing so simple, but his range of movement through a workday had increased because the things he needed most were within reach, and the things that could wait were stored farther away, and Abigail had found a low stool she'd repositioned near the main counter so he could work sitting down during the tasks that didn't require him to be upright. He had not thanked her for this. He had simply started using the stool, which was its own kind of thanks. The third thing was Hank Briggs. Hank had spent the first week watching for the moment he could use to define her. The mistake, the weakness, the telling sign that would prove he'd been right at the stagecoach stop, that would give him a legitimate grievance to bring to Caleb. He was patient about it. He was experienced in this particular kind of campaign, and he knew the value of waiting. What he hadn't expected was that she wasn't going to give him a moment. Not because she was perfect. She was not perfect. She burned the cornbread on Thursday morning because she was distracted thinking about the north fence supply Caleb had mentioned, and she set the pan down too hard, and Walt raised an eyebrow at her from his stool. She had also miscalculated the bean ration on Wednesday, and they'd come up short at the far end of the table, and she'd spent Thursday recalculating everything in a ledger she'd started keeping in a slim book she carried in her apron pocket. She made mistakes. She simply didn't make the particular mistakes Hank was watching for. The emotional ones, the defensive ones, the ones that meant she could be rattled. On Friday afternoon, Hank made his first direct move. He came into the kitchen while Walt was resting in the back and Abigail was working through the stores, checking quantities against her ledger. He didn't knock. Men like Hank Briggs don't knock on doors they've never had to knock on before. "Need to talk to you," he said. "All right," she said without stopping what she was doing. "You're making changes around here." "Some small ones," she said. "Nobody asked you to." "Mr. Rowan didn't say not to," she said. Hank moved further into the kitchen, positioning himself in the way men sometimes do when they want to remind you that they're larger than you are. It was a thing she'd seen before, and she found it tedious. "Walt's been running this kitchen for 11 years, Hank said. I know, she said. He's good at it. Then why are you— I'm not running the kitchen, Hank. She set down her ledger and looked at him directly. I'm helping Walt run it better. If you want to argue about whether that's useful, you could ask the men whether they'd like to go back to burnt cornbread and underseasoned pork. She held the look for a moment. Or you could go back to the fence line, which I believe you told Cal needed attention before the rain comes. Hank stared at her. I have nothing against you, she said, but I'm not going to pretend to be less capable than I am to make you more comfortable. That's not something I'm willing to do. He left. He didn't slam the door. That, she thought, was probably the most unsettling thing he could have done, leaving without the dramatic exit, which meant he was recalculating, not retreating. She went back to her ledger. She had a lot of work to do before winter. The ledger she kept in her apron pocket had 17 pages filled by the end of the second week. Not recipes. Not lists in any form a person would recognize as organized. More like a conversation she was having with herself. Numbers on one side, questions on the other. How much salt pork was left and how long it needed to last. Which root vegetables stored longest in which conditions. Where the cold came from in the supply room, she'd noticed a gap near the floor on the north wall that let air through, thin as a whisper but consistent, which meant the temperature in there was lower than it should be in late summer and would be punishing come October. She showed the gap to Walt on a Tuesday afternoon. He looked at it for a long moment, crouching down the way men do when their back is bad, sideways, careful, like a door with a damaged hinge. And then he said, "Been there since I started." "Has it caused problems?" "Lost a side of beef one February," he said. "Couldn't figure why it went bad faster than it should have." "That's why," she said. Walt was quiet for a moment. "I thought it was the beef." "It was the cold pattern," she said. "The gap draws air and the temperature drops unevenly. Things near the north wall cool faster and cycle more, freeze a little, thaw a little. That's what turns meat." She wasn't lecturing him. That was the thing about Abigail's way of explaining. It never felt like a correction, even when it was. She had a tone that said, "Here's a thing I noticed," rather than "Here's a thing you missed." And the difference between those two tones was the difference between a man feeling informed and a man feeling stupid. And Walt had been made to feel stupid enough times in his life that he noticed the absence of it. "How do you know that?" he asked. "My father stored everything," she said. "We had a cold house in Texas, which is harder to manage than a cold house here because the temperature fluctuates more. He spent years figuring out where things went wrong. I spent years watching him." She paused. "He died before he got it fully right. I figured out the last part on my own." Walt looked at her. "How old were you?" 17, she said. "Then I ran the house until my mother died. Then my brother took the house, so I was elsewhere for a while." She said the last part without inflection, the way people name things that hurt too much for emphasis. Walt didn't push it. He had enough elsewhere of his own to know not to. "I'll get the gap patched," he said. "Know a hand who owes me." "Thank you, Walt." "Don't thank me," he said, already moving. "Thank your daddy." Caleb noticed the ledger on a Wednesday evening. He came into the kitchen, which he had begun doing more often, not always for a stated reason, which Abigail had noticed and chosen not to comment on, and found her at the table with it open, a stub of pencil in her hand, the kind of focused expression that meant she was in the middle of a calculation and the world outside it had ceased to exist. He poured himself a cup of coffee from the pot she always kept on at this hour, sat down across from her without being invited, and waited until she'd finished the line she was working on. "What is that?" he asked. "Supply accounting," she said. "But more specific than what you've been keeping." He stiffened slightly. She'd learned to read that stiffness in him. Not defensiveness exactly, more the particular tension of a man who knows something hasn't been done well and isn't sure if he's being judged for it. "I'm not criticizing your words," she said, before he could harden further. "Your records tell you what's there. I'm trying to work out what we need and when and in what sequence, so we're not making emergency decisions in November." He looked at the ledger. She turned it toward him. The numbers were dense, but the logic was clear, or would be to anyone who gave it real attention. "You've mapped this out through February," he said. "March," she said. "February's when people think they need to start worrying. By then it's too late to correct. The real decisions happen in September." Caleb looked at the page for a long moment. "We've had bad winters before," he said. "We managed." "You managed," she agreed. I'm trying to make it so managing isn't the goal. I want the men fed through March without anyone having to make hard calls about rationing. She paused. And I want to fix the north wall gap in the supply room before it costs us another side of beef. He looked up. Walt told you about the beef? Walt told me about the gap. I made the inference. Caleb set down his coffee cup. He had a habit of doing that when he was thinking, setting things down, as if he needed his hands free to think clearly. She'd noticed that too. Claire used to say I managed things, he said. Not bitterly. Just as a fact, the way a man states something he's still making peace with. She said managing and planning weren't the same thing. She was right, Abigail said. She was right about most things, he said. Then he seemed to realize what he'd said and where he'd said it, and there was a brief, complicated moment between them that neither of them knew what to do with. I'm not trying to be Clara, Abigail said quietly. I couldn't be, and I wouldn't try. But I'd like to help you not be in crisis every winter, if that's something you want help with. The question was genuine. She had learned not to assume. Caleb looked at her for a long time. Yes, he said finally. That's something I want help with. It was the most direct thing he'd said to her since she arrived, and they both knew it, and neither of them made it larger than it was by commenting on it. She got Noah's name from Caleb that night and a small piece of his story. Not much, just enough to outline the shape of the wound. 7 years old. His mother had been sick for a long time before she died, which meant Noah had spent some of his most formative years watching someone he loved disappear slowly, helplessly. And then she was gone, and there was a house that felt wrong, and a father who grieved in the particular closed-off way men are taught to grieve, and ranch hands who were good men mostly, but didn't know what to do with a small silent boy, and 2 years of an emptiness that had calcified around him like something protective and something dangerous at the same time. He had not warmed to the women Caleb's sister had sent out. There had been 2. Neither had stayed long. Noah, Caleb said with a particular weight, had made his position clear in ways that didn't require words. He's not a mean boy, Caleb said. I know, she said. Mean boys don't wash the glasses they borrow. Caleb looked at her. He came to the kitchen? First night, she said. I pretended not to see him. Something moved through Caleb's face that he managed to contain but not entirely. He hasn't done that with anyone else. I didn't talk to him, she said. I just made sure the milk was available and didn't make a production of it. How'd you know to do that? She thought about it for a moment because she wanted to answer honestly, and the honest answer wasn't a simple one. My mother died when I was 16, she said. My father after. I had a brother who tried very hard to take care of me and didn't know how, and I had 2 aunts who tried very hard to replace my mother and didn't understand why that made things worse. She turned the pencil in her fingers. Sometimes what a person needs isn't someone trying. Sometimes it's someone just being present without requiring anything back. Caleb was quiet for a long time. He might warm to you, he said. He might, she said. And if he doesn't, that's all right too. I'm not going anywhere. The first time Noah spoke to her directly was on a Saturday, which was the 9th day after her arrival, and it happened over something as undramatic as a broken harness buckle. He'd been in the barn. She'd seen him heading that way and had not followed, was nowhere near the barn, was in fact walking from the supply room back to the kitchen when she heard a sound that was unmistakably a small person trying very hard not to cry, which is a sound entirely distinct from crying and in many ways harder to hear. She stopped walking. She stood outside the barn for a moment, decided, and went in. Noah was sitting on an overturned crate with a bridle in his lap and a buckle that had come apart in his hands, and a look on his face that was the specific combination of frustrated and ashamed and trying not to show either. He was 7 years old and he had clearly been attempting to fix the buckle himself, probably because he'd broken it somehow, probably because he wasn't supposed to be using it, and now it was worse than when he started. He saw her and went rigid, his jaw set. His eyes dared her to make something of it. She looked at the buckle. What happened to it? His jaw tightened more. Nothing. It looks like the pin sheared, she said, coming closer, crouching down to his level to look at it properly. That happens when there's lateral pressure. Were you using it to pull something? He didn't answer, which was an answer. Do you know where your father keeps the spare pins? She asked. A very long pause. No. I found a tin of them in the supply room this week, she said. Left side, third shelf. I noticed because I was trying to figure out what was in it. I thought it was rivets. She stood back up. If you want to fix it yourself, I can show you which ones will fit and show you how the receipt works. It's not complicated, and your father won't know it was ever broken. Noah stared at her with his mother's eyes in his father's face and said nothing for a moment. Then he said very quietly, "You're not going to tell him?" "I don't know what to tell him," she said. "I don't know what happened." It was honest. She genuinely didn't know, and she didn't push. She just waited. Noah looked down at the buckle. "I was pulling Rascal," he said. Rascal, she would learn, was a young steer he'd apparently decided was his personal project without anyone's permission. He didn't want to come, and I was pulling too hard. Lateral pressure, she said. "Yeah." "All right," she said. "Do you want to fix it?" He looked up at her. 7 years old and already exhausted by the effort of not trusting people. "You're not going to tell me I shouldn't have been pulling Rascal." "Should you have been?" "Probably not." "Then you already know," she said. "I don't need to say it." She went to get the pin tin. She showed him how the seat worked. He watched with the intensity of a child who learns things fast and has been underestimated because of it. When the buckle was back together, he held it up and checked it the way she'd shown him, pulling the mechanism with his thumb to test the catch. "It's right," he said. "It's right," she agreed. He didn't thank her, but he also didn't leave immediately, which was, she was learning, Noah's version of gratitude. He sat on the crate for another minute, looking at the repaired buckle, and then he said without looking at her, "Walt said you moved the flower." "I did. His back is better." "A little. He doesn't sit down during breakfast anymore," Noah said. "He used to always sit down during breakfast and get back up slower than he sat down." She looked at the boy. "You noticed that?" "I notice things," he said, and with the particular dignity of a child who has decided to extend something. "I'm Noah." "I know," she said. "I'm Abigail." He nodded, solemn. Then he slid off the crate, tucked the bridle under his arm, and walked back toward the pasture without another word. She watched him go and stayed very still for a moment after he disappeared, because the feeling in her chest was too large and too new to move around with immediately. By the third week, the thing that had been happening quietly became impossible to ignore, not because it was dramatic, but because the contrast had accumulated past the point where anyone could pretend not to see it. The meals at Iron Ridge were different, not fancy, not elaborate. Nothing about the ingredients had fundamentally changed, but the preparation had, and more importantly, the timing had. And the result was that men came to the table having already smelled what was coming from 40 yards away, and sat down hungry in a different way than hungry, which was the particular anticipatory hunger that is half memory and half hope. Danny Pruitt told 3 of the younger hands one evening that he'd been eating ranch food for 4 years and had thought he'd figured out the ceiling on what it could be. He said this not as a complaint, but as a recalibration, the way a man describes finding out he'd been looking at a map that was missing a country. Older hands were less verbal about it, but more consistent. Men who'd been eating without comment for years began staying at the table a few minutes longer than necessary, not because there was more food, but because leaving felt like a loss in a way it hadn't before. Even Hank Briggs, who was too prideful to acknowledge anything directly, had started arriving for meals precisely on time, which he hadn't done in Caleb's memory. Caleb noticed. Of course he noticed. He had built this ranch on noticing things, and then, in the years of grief after Clara, had stopped being able to look at it clearly. Abigail's arrival had done something uncomfortable and necessary. It had put a contrast into the house that made the years of drift visible. He didn't talk to her about it directly. Not yet. I was still a man who came at things sideways, approaching a conversation he wanted to have from the direction of a different one, and Abigail had learned to recognize this and wait. What she wasn't prepared for was the conversation that arrived from outside Iron Ridge entirely. His name was Gerald Holt, and he owned the largest spread in the valley, Holt's Cross, 4 times the size of Iron Ridge, staffed by more hands than Caleb employed in a good year. He was 50-something, lean the way some men stay lean their whole lives without trying, with the particular confidence of a man who had been the most powerful person in every room he'd entered for 20 years and had stopped registering it as unusual. He arrived on a Thursday morning while Caleb was out on the North Range, which may or may not have been calculated. He came to the kitchen door, which was unusual. Men of Gerald Holt's standing did not come to kitchen doors, and knocked, which surprised Walt so thoroughly that he almost knocked the pin tin off the shelf. Abigail came to the door drying her hands on a cloth. Holt looked at her with the efficient appraisal of a man who is used to assessing the value of things quickly. Then he smiled. It was a good smile, practiced and warm, the kind that had opened a lot of doors. "Miss Mercer," he said, "I've been hearing interesting things." She had not met him before. That he knew her name was information. "Mr. Holt," she said, "you'd better come in." She offered him coffee, which was what you did, and he accepted, which was what men like him did when they wanted to seem approachable. He sat at the kitchen table with his hat on the chair beside him, and he looked around the kitchen with the same efficient appraisal he'd applied to her. "I had a man at a billing suppliers meeting 2 weeks ago," he said. "Ran into Danny Pruitt in town. Danny's not a quiet kid. He talked about the changes out here in some detail." He wrapped his hands around the coffee cup. "Then I heard from the Greer family, who traded with Walt last week, and from Patterson, who said one of your hands mentioned you had a winter prep system they hadn't seen before." "I wouldn't call it a system," she said. "It's just planning." "Planning other people aren't doing," he said, "which makes it a system." He looked at her directly. "Miss Mercer, I'm going to be blunt because I think you're the kind of person who prefers it." "I do," she said. "I'm expanding my operation. I'm looking for someone to run my household and my supply management, and I'm willing to pay a wage that I'd wager is more than your current arrangement offers." He paused. "Holt's Cross is not Iron Ridge. It's large, it's stable, and it has a staff that doesn't require the level of reconstruction that you appear to have been engaged in here." The kitchen was very quiet. Walt, at his station, had not moved. Abigail looked at Gerald Holt for a long moment. She thought about what it meant that he'd come here, that he'd learned enough to come, that he'd calculated that coming to the kitchen door was the right approach. He was not a stupid man. He had read her correctly on several counts. She did prefer blunt, she had been doing reconstruction, and his offer was almost certainly financially superior to her current situation. None of that was the point. "I appreciate the directness," she said, "and I'll match it. Iron Ridge is where I came to. It's not a posting I'm managing until something better comes along." She set down her own cup. "The preparation you heard about, the planning, I'm doing it because I'll be here in February when it matters. That changes the nature of the work." Holt looked at her steadily. "A more comfortable situation." "Comfortable isn't what I came to Montana for," she said. He was quiet for a moment, reassessing. Then he said, "Caleb Rowan is not in an easy position." "No," she said, "he's not. His operation has struggled for 2 years. 3, she said. The 3rd year before Clara died, she was sick enough that things started slipping, so 3. Something shifted in Holt's expression, respect maybe, or the recalibration of someone who had expected a different kind of conversation. "You know his operation better than he's had time to tell you." "I pay attention," she said. Holt picked up his hat. He took his time about it, the way men do when they want you to know they're not being rushed. "My offer stands," he said. "You should know that." "Thank you," she said. "I hope your supply prep goes well this fall." He smiled at that. A different kind of smile, smaller, genuinely entertained. "Good morning, Miss Mercer." He left. The kitchen door closed behind him. Walt turned from his station and looked at her. "That man hasn't ridden to a kitchen door in his life," Walt said. "I know," she said. "You could have gone," Walt said. "Would have been easier." She picked up her ledger from the shelf and opened it back to the page she'd been working on. "Easier wasn't what I came to Montana for either," she said. Walt turned back to his work, but she saw his shoulders settle differently, and she understood what that meant. She told Caleb about Holt's visit that evening, not because she was required to, and not as a kind of negotiation. She told him because she had decided early that their arrangement, whatever it was and was becoming, would not survive dishonesty, and honesty included things that were uncomfortable to say and might produce reactions she couldn't predict. Caleb's reaction was a long silence. Then, "He came here." "This morning," she said, "while you were north." "To the kitchen door." "Yes." Another silence. "And you turned him down." "I did." He looked at the far wall for a while, which was his way of looking inward. "Why?" She had thought about how to answer this because there were several true answers, and not all of them were things she was ready to say yet. She chose the one that was true and also appropriately limited. Because I didn't come here to leave, she said, and because what I'm doing here isn't done. It's not. Abigail, you don't owe this ranch anything. I know I don't, she said. I'm not here because I owe it. He looked at her. The evening light through the kitchen window was the particular amber of late Montana summer, the kind that makes everything look slightly more permanent than it is. The men have started talking about you, he said. Not the way they were, different now. I know, she said. Even Hank's quieter about it. Hank's recalculating, she said. He's not convinced, he's waiting. Caleb almost smiled. It was the closest thing to a smile she'd seen from him, and it arrived and left quickly, the way light moves when clouds are uncertain. You see him clearly. I see most people clearly, she said. I've had a lot of practice. He looked down at the table. I owe you an apology, he said. She waited. For not meeting the stage, he said. I told myself it was the fence. It wasn't only the fence. He paused. I was afraid of the whole thing, of what it meant, bringing someone else in. I didn't handle it well. Abigail looked at him. He wasn't looking at her. She had learned that about him. He could say true things easier when he wasn't looking directly at the person he was saying them to. I know you were afraid, she said. I was afraid too. That surprised him. He looked up. You didn't show it. No, she said. I never do. A small pause. That's not always a virtue. They sat in the kitchen while the amber light shifted and faded, and what was between them, still unnamed, still careful, still provisional in all the important ways, became something slightly less fragile than it had been the day before. Not by much, but enough to matter, the way small things at Iron Ridge were consistently turning out to matter more than anyone had anticipated. Outside in the barn, a 7-year-old boy was checking on a steer named Rascal, running his hand along the animal's side the way she'd watched him do twice now from a distance, quiet and certain, in that world he'd made for himself out of the parts of this ranch nobody else paid attention to. He had not called her by name again since the barn, but he had begun appearing in doorways, kitchen, supply room, back porch, and staying there just long enough that she understood it was intentional, and then disappearing again before anything was required of either of them. It was slow. It was imperfect. It was exactly the kind of progress that doesn't look like progress until you're far enough past it to turn around. The Saturday that changed everything between the men and Abigail was not one she'd planned. It happened because of weather, which is how most things happen in Montana. Not because of intention, but because the land made decisions and people responded. A hard wind came down from the north that morning, the first real cold front of the coming season, arriving 3 weeks earlier than Caleb had expected based on every prior year he'd ranched here. The temperature dropped 15 degrees in 4 hours. A section of the south pasture fence went down under a falling pine branch, and all available hands, including Danny, including the older men who were supposed to have the day easy, were out repairing it through the middle of the day. They came back cold and short-tempered and wet, in the particular way of men who have been working in wind rather than rain, which means they're chilled down to the level where warmth feels like an impossibility. Abigail had seen the front coming by late morning. She had adjusted everything accordingly, not in a visible way, not in a way that announced preparation. She had simply done it, the way people do when they've spent a life reading weather and circumstance. When the men came through the cookhouse door, there was heat. There was food that had been timed to arrive ready at the exact point they'd return, which was a calculation she'd made based on how long fence repair takes, and how many men were on it, and how bad the wind was. There was a soup Walt had not made before, built from the bones and the preserved vegetables, and seasoned in a way that was different from everything they'd had, and was also somehow exactly right for a man who was cold and depleted, and needed something that restored rather than just filled. Nobody said anything for a long moment after the bowls were placed. Then Grover Marsh, oldest hand on the ranch, 61, the man who had laughed the loudest at the stagecoach stop, set down his spoon, looked at the bowl, looked at nothing in particular, and said, "I'll be damned." It wasn't a compliment exactly. It was more like a statement of involuntary surrender. The kind of thing a man says when a thing he'd decided not to believe in has turned out to be real. Several men looked at him. Nobody spoke. He picked up his spoon and kept eating. And something shifted in that room that Abigail watched from the kitchen doorway. Something she hadn't engineered and wouldn't have known how to engineer. A collective recalibration, quiet and complete. That had nothing to do with her appearance or her origins or what Hank Briggs had said at the stagecoach stop, and everything to do with a bowl of soup in a cold room after a bad morning's work. She went back to the kitchen. She helped Walt with the next round of serving. She didn't say anything, and Walt didn't say anything, and outside the wind kept pulling at the eaves of the cookhouse with the particular insistence of a Montana fall that had decided to arrive early and meant business. In her ledger that night, she added a note in the margin next to the September supply column. It said, "Front came early. Move October preparations to now." She underlined it twice. She had a feeling she was going to need everything to be ready sooner than anyone believed. She didn't know yet how right she was. The note in the margin turned out to be the most important thing she wrote all year. The second cold front arrived not in October but in the last week of September, and it did not arrive like a front. It arrived like a verdict. 3 days of temperature that dropped faster than anyone who hadn't lived through a bad Montana winter could believe, followed by snow that came horizontally instead of down, driven by a wind that found every gap in every structure and made it known. The kind of storm that doesn't just inconvenience a ranch, it tests whether a ranch deserves to survive. Iron Ridge survived it without losing a single animal and without a single man going hungry. Not because of luck, because of a ledger that had been updated twice a week for 6 weeks, because of a supply room with a patched north wall and reorganized shelving, because of preserved stores that had been rotated and checked and positioned in the specific sequence that Abigail had worked out on paper before the cold made paperwork impossible. The neighboring ranches did not fare as well. The Patterson spread lost 2 horses to a collapsed lean-to nobody had reinforced before the season. The Greer family spent 4 days on short rations because their supply estimate had assumed October, not late September. Word came in with the first thaw that a smaller operation 15 miles east, a family named Dodds, husband and wife and 3 children, had nearly run out of firewood before a neighbor reached them. Caleb heard all of this in town when the roads opened again, and he came home with it in his face before he'd said a word. He found Abigail in the supply room doing her post-storm inventory, checking what had been used against what remained, updating the ledger for the next phase. "Dodd's family almost didn't make it," he said. She looked up. "Almost?" Harlan Greer got through to them on the 3rd day. They had 1 day of wood left. He leaned against the doorframe. 3 kids. She set down her pencil. The weight of that number, 3 children, 1 day, settled into the room and stayed there. "What do the Dodds have?" she asked. "In terms of land and stores?" "Small parcel, 40 acres. They've been homesteading 4 years, still building up." "Can they make it through the winter if they're better prepared?" Caleb looked at her. "Probably. They're capable people. They just didn't know—" He stopped. "What they didn't know," she said carefully, "is the same thing most of the valley doesn't know. It's not stupidity. It's information nobody's shared." She looked back at her ledger for a moment. Then she made a decision, the way she made most decisions. Not with a dramatic moment, but with a quiet internal shift, like a door closing in one direction and opening in another. "I'd like to go see them," she said. Caleb was quiet for a moment. "The Dodds?" "And the Greers, and Patterson, if he's willing." She picked her pencil back up. "I want to show them the system, what I've been doing here. If it worked for Iron Ridge, it can work for them. And what happens to families in this valley in February matters, regardless of whose land it happens on." He watched her. "You'd give it away." "It's not mine to keep," she said. "I didn't invent winter, Bob." Hank Briggs heard about the proposed visits before Abigail had made a single one. This was not accidental. Hank had a talent for knowing things early, partly through observation and partly through a network of casual conversation he'd cultivated over years, and he had been waiting for the moment that confirmed his theory about Abigail Mercer, which was that she would eventually do something that revealed her true agenda. He came to Caleb on a Tuesday, which was deliberate. Tuesdays were when Caleb rode the western fence line and came back tired and more receptive to concerns framed as practical rather than personal. Abigail wasn't present for the conversation. She heard about it from Danny Pruitt, who had overheard pieces of it near the barn and reported it to her with the guilty honesty of a young man who knew he was navigating between 2 loyalties and wasn't sure he was handling it well. Hank told him, "You're trying to make yourself indispensable to the whole valley," Danny said. "That it's a strategy. That you're building something outside Iron Ridge so you have somewhere to go when things don't work out here." Abigail absorbed this without changing her expression. "What did Caleb say?" Danny shifted. "He didn't say much. He listened." "All right," she said. Are you upset?" She considered the question honestly. "I'm not surprised," she said. "And yes, a little. But not at you." Danny nodded, relieved and uncomfortable in equal measure. Hank's wrong, isn't he? That's not what you're doing." "No," she said, "but I understand why it looks that way to someone who's looking for it." She went back to what she was doing, which was sorting through a second set of dried goods she'd been building up against the long part of winter. "The problem with Hank's theory is that it requires me to be thinking about myself first. And what I'm actually thinking about is what happens to a family with 3 children when the wood runs out." Danny was quiet. "I believe you," he said. "I know you do," she said. "Go eat your supper." "What?" She went to Caleb that night. Not because she felt she owed him an explanation. She'd done nothing that required one. But because she had made herself a rule early on about letting things fester unaddressed, and she intended to keep it. He was at his desk in the front room, going through papers that clearly weren't holding his full attention. He looked up when she came in and then away, which told her Hank's words were still working on him. "Danny told me what Hank said to you," she said. Caleb set down the paper he wasn't reading. "Danny shouldn't have. Maybe not, but I'm glad he did." She sat down in the chair across from him, which she'd started doing in the evenings and which he had never objected to. "I want to ask you a direct question." He looked at her. "All right. Do you believe it? What Hank said?" A long pause. The kind that would have made a less patient person fill it. Abigail waited. "No," he said. "I don't believe it." "But you considered it." "Yes," he said. "I considered it." "That's fair," she said. He frowned slightly. "That's fair? I entertained the idea that you're a man who's been dealing with people's ulterior motives for 2 years," she said. "Your bank, your suppliers, the hands who left after Clara died because they figured the ranch was going under and they wanted to find a stable situation first. You've been navigating bad faith for long enough that it makes sense you'd look for it everywhere." She paused. "I don't take it personally. I just want to be clear about what I'm actually doing." He waited. "I want to go see the Dodds family and the Greers and Patterson," she said. "I want to show them what I've shown Walt and what I've done with the stores here. Not because I want something from them. Because it costs me nothing and it might mean 3 children have firewood in January." She held his gaze. "That's the whole of it." Caleb looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "I'll drive you." She hadn't expected that. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to," he said. "I want to." He picked up the paper he'd been pretending to read. "Saturday, if the roads hold." She stood up. "Saturday," she agreed. She was almost to the door when he said, without looking up from the paper, "Hank was wrong about you from the first day. I should have said so out loud sooner." She didn't turn around. "You're saying it now," she said. "That's enough." The ride to the Dodds homestead took the better part of a morning. The roads were holding, but barely, still rutted and half frozen from the recent storm, and the wagon required Caleb's full attention for long stretches. Abigail sat beside him with her ledger and an extra notebook she'd brought specifically for the Dodds, filled with the core calculations she'd developed, not copied out in her own shorthand, but rewritten in plain language, step by step, in the way you write things for someone who needs to be able to use them without you standing there to explain. She had spent 3 evenings doing that translation. Caleb had seen the light under her door on those nights and understood what it meant without asking. Margaret Dodds was 28 years old and looked 10 years older in the way of women who have been working at the edge of survival long enough that it shows not in their eyes, but in the set of their jaw and the efficiency with which they move, wasting nothing, not even gestures. She met them at the door with a wariness that was not unfriendly, just the particular caution of someone who has learned that visitors sometimes make more work. Her husband Joel was in the back, she said, repairing the lean-to the storm had damaged. He'd be in shortly. Abigail sat at the Dodds' kitchen table and looked at what was there. She didn't do it obviously. She just looked the way she always looked, taking in the details without announcement, The stores she could see from where she sat. The stove, which had a draft problem. She could tell by the way the small amount of smoke was moving near the back. The window seal on the north-facing wall, which was the same problem as Iron Ridge's supply room gap, different location. Margaret brought coffee and sat down across from her with the careful posture of someone who is being polite but is also waiting to find out what this is going to cost. "I heard what Mr. Greer did," Abigail said, "getting through to you on the third day." "We wouldn't have made it another day," Margaret said. She said it plainly, without drama, the way people state things that are still too close to feel fully real. "I know," Abigail said. "I came because I want to show you some things that might keep that from happening again." She opened the notebook. "It's not complicated. Most of it is just timing, knowing what to do in September instead of October, and how to store things so you don't lose them to temperature changes before you can use them." Margaret looked at the notebook, then at Abigail. "Why?" It was the same question Walt had asked, in a different tone. The same question she'd seen in Caleb's face on the first night when she'd pointed out the north wall gap without being asked. "Because you have 3 children," Abigail said, "and because I figured it out and you haven't yet, and keeping it to myself would be a strange kind of selfishness." Margaret was quiet for a long moment. "Most people would charge for that." "I know," Abigail said. "I'm not most people." Joel Dodds came in from the back half an hour later, tall and wind-chapped and initially reserved in the way of men who are proud and don't like feeling like they owe anyone. He sat down and listened. By the end of the first hour, he was asking questions, and by the end of the second, he'd borrowed Abigail's pencil to mark the parts of her notebook he wanted to copy before they left. She let him keep the notebook. She had another at home. She'd write out another copy if other families needed it. Joel Dodds shook Caleb's hand at the door and nodded at Abigail with an expression that was more than gratitude and not quite ready to be named. His wife stood behind him and said quietly, "Come back in the spring." It was not a polite dismissal. It was an invitation. On the drive home, Caleb didn't speak for a long time. Then he said, "You gave them the whole system." "Yes," she said. "The notebook took you 3 evenings." "It did." "You didn't mention that to them." "It wasn't relevant to them," she said. He was quiet again. The horses moved through the half-frozen ruts, and the sky above them was the particular gray of a Montana afternoon that hasn't decided yet whether it's done with you. "Clara would have liked you," he said. It came out differently than he expected, she could tell. Less controlled, more exposed. He didn't take it back. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "I think I would have liked her too." They rode the rest of the way in a silence that was the most comfortable thing between them so far. Gerald Holt heard about the Dodds' visit within a week, because news in a valley moves the way water does, finding every low point, filling every available space. He did not come to the kitchen door this time. He sent a note, formal, addressed to Caleb and to Miss Mercer, inviting them both to a dinner at Holt's Cross the following Friday with several other ranch families. Caleb showed her the note at breakfast. "He's hosting the Greers and the Pattersons," he said, "and the Kimball family from the north side. 5 operations. He wants to watch what happens when I'm in a room with all of them," she said. Caleb looked at her. "Probably." "Are you bothered by that?" "A little," he said. He was honest in the mornings in a way he wasn't always later in the day. Something about the early light seemed to reduce his defenses without his noticing. Holt's a man who likes to understand things before they get past his control. You've become something he doesn't control and doesn't fully understand. "I'm not trying to be anything he needs to manage," she said. "I know," he said. "He doesn't." She looked at the note. "We should go," she said. "You're sure?" "If those families are going to use what I showed the Dodds, it'll go better if there's a conversation they've all been part of," she said. "And if Holt wants to understand what I'm doing, better he understand it correctly than fill in the gaps himself." Caleb nodded slowly. "I'll send the reply." The dinner at Holt's Cross was the kind of gathering that announced itself before you walked through the door. The house was large and deliberate, built to communicate stability and permanence, and the table was set for 12 with a formality that most of the attending ranchers would have found more exhausting than impressive if they'd been honest about it. Holt stood at the head of it with the ease of a man in his natural environment. greeting each family with the specific warmth of someone who has had decades of practice making people feel welcomed and assessed simultaneously. He shook Caleb's hand. He nodded at Abigail with something that was almost respect and not quite deference. "Miss Mercer," he said, "I'm glad you came." "Thank you for the invitation," she said. The first hour was careful. Conversation about the storm, about the early season, about the fence damage the Patterson family was still repairing. Margaret and Joel Dodds were there, quieter than the other families, watching with the specific attention of people who have recently been reminded of how close the margin is. Harlan Greer and his wife Ruth sat across from them, and Harlan was the kind of man who filled silence with talk, which meant the table was never short of conversation, even when conversation wasn't the point. Holt waited until the meal was well underway before he made his move. It was a good dinner. His cook was skilled, and the quality of the food was itself a kind of message. And he waited until the warmth of it had softened the table slightly, which was calculated and effective. "Miss Mercer," he said from his end of the table. Not loud, just pointed enough that the whole table heard and understood they were meant to. "I understand you've been sharing your preparation methods with some of the families in the valley." The table went quiet in degrees. Abigail set down her fork with the deliberateness of someone buying 1 second to choose the right register for what came next. "I showed the Dodds family some of what I've been doing at Iron Ridge," she said, "and I'd be glad to share it with anyone here who wants it." Holt smiled. "Generous," he said. The word had something underneath it. Not quite a challenge, more like a test being administered in a friendly tone. "Practical," she said. "A valley where families are losing livestock and running short before February is a harder valley for everyone, including Iron Ridge." Harlan Greer laughed, a genuine laugh, the kind that doesn't wait for permission. "She's got you there, Gerald." "She does," Holt said. His smile held. He was looking at Abigail with the expression of a man who has revised his assessment twice already and is doing it a third time. "My question is whether this valley is ready to organize around a shared system. That kind of coordination takes trust." "It takes information," Abigail said. "Trust comes from what people do with it." Ruth Greer, who had been quiet through the first half of the evening and was, Abigail had noted, the sharpest person at the table, said, "What would it look like practically? This coordination?" And that was the moment the dinner became something different from what Holt had intended, because Abigail answered Ruth Greer's question with the same direct clarity she brought to everything, and Ruth asked a follow-up, and Margaret Dodd spoke for the first time in the evening, and Tom Patterson asked about the North Wall principle, and within 20 minutes the table had reorganized itself around a conversation that had nothing to do with Holt's agenda and everything to do with surviving the coming winter. Holt watched it happen. He did not look displeased exactly. He looked like a man recalculating the direction of something he thought he was managing, and finding that it had already moved past him without anyone's ill intent. Caleb watched Abigail. She was not performing. She was not managing the room. She was just answering questions, clearly and without embellishment, the same way she talked to Walt in the kitchen and to Noah in the barn. The same tone regardless of who was listening. He found this, and he could not have articulated it fully, to be the most convincing thing about her. The consistency of it. She was the same person at a formal table in Holt's dining room as she was at 5 in the morning in a cold kitchen with a ledger and a stub of pencil. After the dinner, in the yard while the horses were being brought around, Gerald Holt found a moment beside Caleb without the table between them. "Your wife is—" He stopped, corrected himself. "Miss Mercer is exceptional." "She's not my wife yet," Caleb said. "No," Holt said. "But she will be." He said it not as a prediction, but as a fact he'd observed, the way he observed land values and water rights. "And when she is, you'll want to understand what you have." He looked across the yard to where Abigail was speaking with Margaret Dodds. The two women standing close in the cold, Margaret nodding at something Abigail had just said. "That's not a compliment I give easily, Rowan." Caleb watched Abigail across the yard and said nothing. He didn't need to. The public insult came 3 weeks later, at the Cascade County Supply Merchants gathering in town, which happened 4 times a year and was the closest thing the valley had to a formal social event. The man who delivered it was a rancher named Curtis Bodine, 45, loud in the way of men who have never had to be quiet, and connected to Holt through a series of business arrangements that had made him comfortable and had not improved his character. He had been making comments about Caleb's arrangement since before Abigail arrived, the kind of comments that circulate at the edge of earshot, testing whether they'll be challenged. At the supply gathering, with enough people present to constitute an audience, Bodine decided to stop keeping his comments at the edge. He said it loud enough to stop 3 conversations nearby. He looked at Abigail directly, in a way that was meant to humiliate, and he said, "Don't know what Caleb was thinking, sending all the way to Texas for that. Must have got the order wrong somewhere along the line." He was talking about how she looked. He was saying it to her face, in public, with the confidence of a man who believes women like her will absorb it quietly because they've learned they have to. The people nearby went very still. Caleb, who was 6 feet from Bodine, went a different kind of still. The kind that happens right before a decision gets made. Abigail put her hand on Caleb's arm, not urgently, just there. A contact that said, "Wait." She looked at Bodine. She looked at him for a long enough moment that the silence became its own kind of pressure. Then she said, "The Dodds family had 1 day of firewood left when the second front came through. 3 children. I showed them how to prepare so that doesn't happen again. I've shown 4 other families the same." She paused. "I'm planning to show anyone in this valley who asks before the hard part of winter comes." She held Bodine's gaze. "I don't know what you do with your time, Mr. Bodine, but that's what I've been doing with mine." She turned back to the merchant's counter where she'd been placing her order. The silence held for a moment longer. Then Harlan Greer, who was standing near the door, said, not to anyone specifically, just into the room. "Dodd's family said the same thing. 1 day of wood." He shook his head. 3 kids. The weight of that moved through the room differently than Bodine's words had. You could feel it shift. Bodine left shortly after. He didn't say anything else. That was the thing about shame. It requires an audience that's still with you, and the audience in that room had moved. Ruth Greer found Abigail at the counter and stood beside her while the merchant finished the order. "That was well done," she said quietly. "It wasn't strategy," Abigail said. "I know," Ruth said. "That's what made it well done." Caleb didn't say anything about it until they were in the wagon heading back, and what he said was not what she expected. "I should have spoken first," he said. "You would have hit him," she said. "Probably," he admitted. "That would have made his point for him," she said, "that I need someone to defend me." Caleb held the reins. His jaw was still carrying the shape of the restraint it had taken him. "You've been defending yourself your whole life," he said. It wasn't accusatory. It was the particular tone of someone who has understood something they wish they'd understood sooner. "Yes," she said. "But I didn't do it alone today." She looked at him. "You were standing there. That mattered." He nodded slowly, looking at the road. "What Greer said," she added, "that mattered more." "Harlan will talk to everyone in the valley before Tuesday," Caleb said. "He can't help it. It's how he's built." "I know," she said. And there was the smallest hint of something in her voice. Not quite satisfaction, not that calculated, but something close to the feeling a person gets when the truth decides on its own to go where it needs to go. Noah was awake when they got home. She knew because the light was on in his room and she could hear the particular kind of restlessness in the house that a child in an upstairs bedroom generates when they're trying to seem asleep. She went upstairs and knocked on his door. She had started knocking because she'd decided early that his space was his and she would not enter it without being asked. "Yeah," he said. She opened the door. He was in his bed with a book he'd clearly just picked up to look like he'd been reading, and the lamp was lit, and his hair was the specific disorder of a child who has been lying awake for hours. "You weren't at supper," she said. "Danny said you ate in the barn." He looked at the book. "I was with Rascal. Is he all right?" A pause. "He had a cough earlier." "Is it a wet cough or a dry one?" He looked up. "Wet," he said, "but it stopped by afternoon." "Keep watching him," she said. "Wet coughs that stop on their own are usually nothing. But if it comes back tomorrow, tell your father before it gets cold tonight." He nodded. Then, without looking at her, "Danny said someone was mean to you in town." She came and sat on the low stool near his door. Not on the bed, not close enough to crowd him, just in the room. "Danny talks," she said. "He said you were really calm," Noah said. "He said you didn't even look upset." "I was a little upset," she said. "I just didn't show it." Noah was quiet for a moment. "Why not?" It was a genuine question, the kind only children ask because adults have already accepted that feelings are things you manage privately. Because showing it would have given that man something, she said, and I didn't want him to have it. Noah thought about this with the focused seriousness he brought to everything. Did Dad want to hit him? Yes, she said. Did you stop him? I did. Why? Because hitting him would have made things worse, she said. And your father knew that, which is why he let me stop him. Noah turned this over. Rascal tried to bite Grover once, he said. Grover wanted to smack him. I said don't, and Grover didn't, and now Rascal doesn't try to bite anymore. Abigail looked at the boy, 7 years old and already drawing lines between one thing and another, finding the principle underneath. That's exactly right, she said. He slid down in the bed, pulling the cover up. You can go, he said. Not rudely, just finished. She stood up. She turned the lamp down for him. Not all the way, just enough. Because she'd noticed over the weeks that he didn't like the full dark, and she had never mentioned this to anyone, and she never would. At the door, she stopped. Abigail, he said. She turned. I'm glad you didn't let Dad hit him, he said. He paused. And I'm glad you didn't cry. She stood very still for a moment. Me too, she said. She pulled the door most of the way closed and stood in the hallway for a moment, her hand still on the door, not moving, because the feeling in her chest was the same one she'd felt in the barn when he'd told her his name, but larger now, with more weight to it, the kind of weight that is not a burden, but an anchor. Downstairs, Caleb was at his desk. He heard her on the stairs and looked up. He was awake, she said. He usually is when we're late, Caleb said. He looked at her for a moment. Is he all right? He's fine, she said. He wanted to know if you were going to hit someone. Caleb let out a short breath that was almost a laugh. What did you tell him? The truth, she said, that you wanted to. He looked at her across the room, the amber lamp between them, the house settling around them in the cold, outside the first real winter pressing its weight against the walls. And something in his expression was different from what she'd seen before. Less guarded, more certain, the way a man looks when he's stopped arguing with himself about something. He didn't say what he was thinking. Not yet. But he didn't look away, and she didn't either. And for a moment the house held the particular quality of a place where something important is happening very quietly. Then she said goodnight and went to her room and lay awake for a while listening to Montana doing what Montana does in late fall, making itself known, pressing in, reminding everyone inside every structure that the warmth they had was something they'd built and maintained and could not take for granted. She thought about the Dodds family with their patched lean-to and their restocked firewood. She thought about Ruth Greer saying that's what made it well done. She thought about Noah's voice in the dark saying, I'm glad you didn't cry, which was the most unguarded thing he'd said to her yet, which meant something she didn't want to examine too closely because it was still fragile and she was still learning. She thought about the months ahead. She thought about what was coming, the kind of winter this valley hadn't seen in years, the signs of which she'd been reading in the early fronts, and the pattern of the cold and the margin she kept writing into the ledger in larger and larger numbers. She would need more from herself in the next few months than she'd needed from herself in a long time. She hoped she had it. She thought she did. But she also knew that thinking you're ready and being ready are two different things, and the distance between them was exactly where a Montana winter liked to live. The winter that came in December of 1884 was not like the two fronts that had preceded it. Those had been warnings. This was the thing itself. It arrived on a Thursday night without the usual signs. No particular shift in the animals' behavior that afternoon. No change in the way the smoke moved from the cookhouse chimney. None of the atmospheric pressure drop that experienced men read in their sinuses and their old injuries. It simply came, the way catastrophe sometimes does, without the courtesy of announcement. By midnight, the temperature had dropped to levels that made the previous cold feel like inconvenience. And by Friday morning, there was no question of riding out, no question of reaching town, no question of anything except survival and the management of the hours ahead. Caleb was up before dawn. He stood in the kitchen doorway looking at the thermometer on the north porch post, and his face had the specific quality of a man doing arithmetic and not liking the answer. Abigail was already at the stove. She had been up since 3. Not because she'd known, she hadn't known any more than anyone else. But she'd woken with the particular alertness that comes sometimes in the deep part of a winter night, the body registering something the conscious mind hasn't processed yet. And she'd lain still for 1 minute listening to the quality of the silence outside, which was the silence of something pressing down rather than simply being absent. Then she'd gotten up. The fires in the main house were all going by the time Caleb found her. The cookhouse fire was built up. She'd confirmed that before coming back inside. The supply room door was sealed with the folded burlap she'd prepared in October specifically for this, a gap stopper for the bottom of the door that would slow the temperature exchange. The water in the kitchen had been moved away from the north wall before she'd gone to bed the previous night, not because she'd predicted this storm, but because she'd made it a habit in November to assume every night might be the one. Caleb looked at the stove. He looked at her. He didn't say anything for a moment. "How bad?" she asked. "Worse than anything I've seen since '79, he said. "Winds coming from the northeast. That's the worst direction for this valley." "How long can it hold?" "Could be 2 days. Could be 5. He moved to the coffee she had already made. "The horses need to be checked." "Danny and Grover went out 20 minutes ago," she said. "I woke them. I hope that was all right." He looked at her again. "You woke them." "I heard the wind change around 3, she said. "I wasn't sure how much time we'd have before it was dangerous to go out." He set down the coffee cup with the deliberateness she'd learned to recognize as his version of a strong reaction being controlled. "You should have woken me." "You were asleep," she said. And I needed Danny and Grover moving, not managing. I'm sorry if I overstepped." He shook his head, not in dismissal of the apology, but in something more complicated. The expression of a man being confronted with how much has already been handled without him, and feeling the double weight of relief and inadequacy that comes with it. "You didn't overstep," he said. He stopped. "I know," she said. "You'd rather have been up." "Yes." "Next time wake me when you wake up," she said. "We'll go together." The particular word, together, sat in the kitchen for a moment between them, not weighted with anything deliberate, just present, and both of them registered it without making anything of it, which was its own kind of making something of it. The first full day of the storm was managed. Not easily, not without cost. Caleb and Two Hands spent 4 hours in conditions that should have sent them back inside, reinforcing the east wall of the main barn where the wind was finding a weakness in the upper boards. They came back with the kind of cold in them that takes hours to leave, not on the surface but inside the chest, the particular internal cold that makes a man's movements slow and deliberate as he thaws. Abigail had food ready that was calibrated for that kind of returning, heavy and hot and not fussy, the kind that restores body temperature rather than impressing anyone. Noah had spent the day indoors, which he'd accepted with less resistance than she'd expected. He'd positioned himself near the kitchen by mid-morning, not underfoot but adjacent, doing the things he found to do in small spaces, a piece of leather he was working on, a wooden figure he'd been carving slowly for 2 weeks with a small knife his father had given him. He asked questions intermittently, the way children do when they're processing something they're uncertain about but don't want to show are uncertain about. "Will Rascal be all right?" he asked, around noon. "He's in the main barn," she said. "Your father reinforced the east wall this morning. It'll hold." "How do you know?" "Because I know your father doesn't do things by half," she said. Noah considered this. "He didn't used to fix things fast enough," he said. It was stated without accusation, just as an observation, the way children report what they've seen before they've learned to soften it. "No," she said. "He was having a hard time for a while. After Mama died." "Yes." Noah turned the wooden figure in his hands. "He's better now," he said. She looked at him. "Yes," she said. "He is." Noah nodded, satisfied with the confirmation, and went back to his carving. The storm pressed against the windows, and the fire held, and the house had the sealed, intimate quality of a place that is doing exactly what it was built to do. The crisis arrived on the second night. It came not from the storm's physical damage, but from a knock on the door at near on 10 o'clock, which, given the conditions, meant something had gone badly wrong somewhere near enough for someone to have made it through the wind to get to them. It was Harlan Greer. He was on horseback, which in those conditions was not a decision a man makes unless the alternative is worse. His coat was packed with ice on the windward side, and his hands, when Caleb pulled him through the door, were the color of things that have been too cold for too long. He'd ridden 40 minutes in a near blizzard. Abigail had him at the kitchen table with both hands around a hot cup before he'd fully thawed enough to speak clearly, and she kept herself busy and unobtrusive while Caleb crouched in front of him with the focused patience of a man who knows the story will come when the body allows it. "Patterson," Harlan finally said. His voice was still roughened by cold. "His supply room wall. The east side, not the north. It failed. He's lost the stores in that section. Not all of it, but the cured meat and the grain reserve both." Caleb looked at Abigail. "How many people on the Patterson spread right now?" she asked. 9, Harlan said. "Him, his wife, 4 hands, and the Carver family that's been staying with them since October. Their place flooded in September, and they haven't rebuilt." 9 people. The Carver family was the detail she latched onto. That was 3 additional people who had not been in Patterson's original calculations, which meant even before the wall failure, his margins had been tighter than they should have been. "How much did he lose?" she asked. Harlan named the amounts as best he could remember from what Patterson had told him. She ran the numbers in her head against what she knew of Iron Ridge's stores. "We have reserves," she said to Caleb, "beyond what we need through March. I built the margin wide because the early fronts told me to." She met his eyes. "We can get supplies to Patterson by morning if the wind drops enough to move." Caleb looked at her for a moment. "That cuts our own margin." "To a level that's still sufficient," she said. "I wouldn't say it if I hadn't checked." The room was quiet except for the storm. Harlan Greer looked between them with the expression of a man who is cold and exhausted and watching something he hadn't expected to see. "It's your call," she said to Caleb. It was important that it was his call. She knew that and meant it. He stood up. "We'll move at first light if the wind allows," he said. "Abigail, what do we pull, and how do we pack it?" She opened the ledger she'd had beside her through the whole conversation. She'd brought it from the shelf the moment Harlan knocked, before she'd known what he was going to say, because storms at night that bring riders to the door are always about resources. "Sit down," she said to Caleb. "Let me show you." They worked at the table for an hour, the 3 of them, while Harlan thought and contributed what details he could about the Patterson layout. Outside, the storm did what it was doing, indifferent to all of it. The wind dropped enough by 5 in the morning. Not gone, nothing so accommodating, but reduced to passable, the kind of cold that is genuinely dangerous but can be moved through with preparation and purpose. Caleb took Danny and 2 other hands and a loaded wagon with the supplies she'd specified, packed the way she'd shown Danny in October, waited for the road conditions. She watched them go from the kitchen window, which was the same window she'd looked out of on her first night, when everything about this place was still unknown, and the boy upstairs was a closed door, and the men who worked here had laughed at her getting off the stage. Noah appeared at her elbow. She hadn't heard him come down. He watched the wagon move into the gray pre-dawn, his father's shape at the front, the horse's breath visible in the cold. "He's going to Patterson's?" he asked. "Yes." "Because of the wall?" "Yes." "With our food?" "Some of it," she said. "We have enough." He watched the wagon disappear. Then he said, "Is that what you planned for? The extra?" She looked at him. He was 8 years old now. His birthday had been in November, a quiet dinner she'd made careful and unhurried, just the 3 of them, which was how Caleb said he'd always preferred it. He had the focused precision in his questions that she'd come to recognize as his primary way of understanding the world, not through touch or emotion first, but through getting the mechanics right and letting the feeling follow. "Yes," she said. "That's exactly what I planned for." He nodded slowly. "Good planning," he said. She almost laughed. "Thank you, Noah." He went back upstairs to get dressed, leaving her at the window. She poured a second cup of coffee and held it with both hands and looked at the landscape the storm had made, white and gray and absolute, the kind of scene that makes the distances of Montana feel less like geography and more like a condition of existence. And she felt the full weight of the months since August compress into the present moment, which was a thing that happened to her sometimes when she'd been moving fast for a long time and then briefly stopped. She had not written to her brother since October. She should do that. She had not thought about Texas in weeks. She was not sure when that had happened, the point at which Montana had stopped being a place she'd come to and started being where she was from. She suspected it had happened gradually, the way most real things happen, without a moment she could point to. Caleb came back by early afternoon. The road had been brutal, and the delivery had taken longer than planned, and he came through the door with the kind of exhaustion that sits in a man's eyes rather than his posture. He ate what she set in front of him without speaking for a while, and she let him, and when he'd been warm and fed long enough for the story to become available, he told her about it. Patterson's east wall had buckled under ice accumulation at the top, a structural issue that had nothing to do with preparation and everything to do with a building that needed repair years ago and had been managed around instead. The stored meat and grain that had been against that wall were a total loss. The stores that remained were what they had, along with what Caleb had brought. Tom Patterson didn't say much, Caleb said. He's a proud man. I know, she said. He looked at the wagon like it was the hardest thing he'd seen in a while. Caleb was quiet for a moment. His wife cried. She turned away first, but I saw. The Carver family? She asked. Safe. Hungry, but safe. He wrapped both hands around his coffee. Their youngest couldn't be more than 4. She was watching me unload with the biggest eyes I've ever seen on a child. Like she was trying to memorize it. He paused. Like she wanted to understand where it came from. Abigail said nothing. She let that image sit. Tom asked me how we had the margin, Caleb said. I told him the truth. I told him Abigail built the plan in August and updated it every week, and the margin was deliberate. He looked at her. He asked if you'd come and show his wife the system in the spring. I'll come, she said. I told him you would. He set down the cup. I told him that without asking you first. I should have. You were right to tell him, she said. You knew I'd come. He looked at her. Yes, he said. I did. There was a pause, not uncomfortable, the kind of pause that has something in it. Abigail, he said. She looked at him. He was quiet for a moment in the way of a man choosing between several versions of what he wants to say, and none of them quite fitting. She recognized this. She had seen him do it before, in smaller moments, and each time she had waited him out. She waited now. I've been thinking about something for a while, he said. Since before the storm, since... He stopped. Started again. I want to say this correctly, and I'm not sure I know how. You don't have to say it correctly, she said. Just say it. He looked at her directly, the way he'd looked at her the night she'd told him about Holt's offer, when something had settled in him. This stopped being an arrangement a long time ago, he said. I don't know exactly when. Somewhere between August and now it became something different, and I've been slow about naming it because I wasn't sure I was allowed to. She held very still. I'm not talking about the ranch, he said, or what you've done here. I know what you've done here. I'm talking about... He stopped again. His jaw moved slightly. I look for you, he said. In the mornings, in the evenings. When something happens, you're the person I want to tell. When I'm riding out, I think about coming back. He looked at the table between them. That's not an arrangement. I don't know what to call it, but it's not that. The kitchen was very still. Outside, the storm had reduced itself to a low, persistent wind, the kind that doesn't demand attention, but reminds you it's there. You can call it what it is, she said. Her voice was steady, which cost her something she didn't let show. I'm not good at this, he said. I know, she said. Neither am I. He looked up. You seem like you are. I seem like a lot of things I'm not, she said. I've been alone for a long time, Caleb. I got good at seeming steady. It's not the same as being all right. He looked at her with the full focus attention he usually reserved for problems he was trying to understand. Are you all right? I'm better than I've been in years, she said. That's true, she paused. I've been careful about what I let myself think since I came here, about what this was, because I didn't want something that wasn't being offered. He was quiet for a long moment. Then, it's being offered. She looked at him for a moment, just looked. Let it be real and in the room without managing it. All right, she said, not dramatically, not with tears or declarations, just, all right. The way you say yes to something that you've already known was true for a while, and hearing it said out loud is less a surprise than a relief. The specific relief of a thing that has been unnamed being named, which removes a weight you'd stopped noticing you were carrying. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, which was the first time he'd done anything like that. And she looked at his hand and then at him, and neither of them said anything else for a while. The storm broke fully by the following afternoon. The valley that emerged from it was the particular white and still of a place that has been tested and is still standing, and the light on the snow had the quality of something newly arrived. The thing that Abigail had not anticipated, the thing that arrived with the thaw and the first possibility of movement between properties, was the speed at which news traveled once the roads opened. Harlan Greer had talked, as Caleb had predicted he would, but he talked with more specificity than she'd expected. Not just about Iron Ridge's preparation, but about the supplies that had gone to Patterson, about the margin she'd built deliberately, about the system that had been shared with the Dodds and the Greers and anyone at the supply merchant gathering who'd been paying attention. By the end of the first week after the storm, she had received 3 notes. One from Margaret Dodds, saying they'd come through without incident and that Margaret wanted to learn more in the spring. One from Ruth Greer, more formal, asking if Abigail would consider speaking at the spring community gathering about preparation methods for the following winter. And one from a family she'd never met, the Halverson family, 12 miles north, asking if someone could come see them before the next cold came. She showed Caleb all 3. He read them in sequence, then set them on the table and looked at her. "This is going to become a significant undertaking," he said. "I know," she said. "Is that a problem?" He thought about it honestly, which she appreciated. He was a man who gave questions the time they deserved rather than answering immediately to seem decisive. "No," he said. "It's not a problem. It might change things for this ranch." "How?" "People tend to align with the people who help them," he said. "That has practical implications. For supply negotiations, for land and water questions. There are some outstanding disputes in this valley that have been stuck for years because nobody has enough relationships on both sides to move them." She looked at him. "You're talking about the creek access issue." He blinked. "How do you know about that?" "Walt mentioned it in October," she said. 2 families disputing the Eastern Creek tributary. He said it had been unresolved for 4 years. 5, Caleb said. "And the reason it's unresolved is that Bodine's been positioning himself as the arbiter and using it to keep both families dependent on his goodwill." She thought about Curtis Bodine at the supply merchant gathering, the way he'd delivered his comment, and the way the room had moved away from him afterward. She thought about Gerald Holt at his dinner table watching the conversation reorganize itself without him. She thought about the slow, patient work of building something that people trust, not because they've been told to, but because they've seen it function. "Spring," she said. Caleb looked at her. "What about it?" "Wait until spring," she said. "Let the relationship settle through the winter. By the time the ground thaws, the families we've helped will have had 3 months to think about what it meant. That's when you approach the creek question, not as Iron Ridge's interest, but as the valley's interest, with enough people behind it that Bodine doesn't have a place to stand." He was quiet for a long moment. "You've been thinking about this?" "Since the dinner at Holt's," she said. "I wasn't sure how to say it without sounding like I was planning beyond what was mine to plan." "It is yours to plan," he said. He stopped. "This is your home." She looked. The word landed the same way it had when she'd said it to Holt back in August. "Iron Ridge is my home." But differently now, weighted differently, because in August it had been an assertion, and now it was simply true. "Yes," she said. "It is." Hank Briggs left Iron Ridge on a Friday in January. He didn't announce it dramatically. He packed his kit on a Thursday night and came to Caleb on Friday morning and said he'd taken a position with a spread up north that needed a foreman. He said it without particular expression, the way a man states a thing he's decided on and doesn't want examined. Caleb let him go. He shook Hank's hand, which was the appropriate thing, and watched him ride out, and then he came back to the kitchen where Abigail was working and sat down without saying anything for a moment. "He was here 11 years, he said. "I know," she said. "He's not a bad man," Caleb said. "He's a man who needs to be the thing that doesn't change. And things changed here." He paused. "I'm not sure that's anyone's fault." She set down what she was doing. "It's not," she said. "It's just what happened." He nodded. "Danny can step up," he said. He's ready. He's been ready." "He has been," she agreed. "He just needs to be asked properly. Don't suggest it. Ask him." Caleb looked at her. "There's a difference?" "With Danny, yes," she said. "He's been underestimated his whole life, too. He needs to hear it stated plainly. Caleb nodded slowly. He was quiet for a moment. You read people very quickly. I've had to, she said. It must be exhausting, he said. It was said without pity, just as an observation, the same way she stated things, directly and without embellishment. She thought about it. Sometimes, she said, it's less exhausting when the people are worth reading. He didn't say anything to that. He just looked at her with the particular look he'd been giving her more frequently since the night of his confession in the kitchen. Not the guarded, closed-off look of the first weeks, but something more settled, more honest. The look of a man who has stopped arguing with himself about what he feels and has arrived at the peculiar peace of simply feeling it. It was Noah who brought the question up, which nobody had expected. It was a Sunday in late January, the particular quiet Sunday that follows a week of hard work and precedes another, and the three of them were at the kitchen table after the midday meal. Caleb with his ledger, Noah with a book he was working through slowly and seriously, Abigail mending a seam on one of Noah's shirts that he'd managed to open on a fence post. Noah set down his book. Are you going to get married? He asked. He addressed the question to neither of them specifically, which was his way of making it available to whoever could answer it. Caleb looked up. Abigail kept her eyes on the seam for one more second, then set it down. We haven't talked about it in those terms, Caleb said carefully. You should, Noah said. He picked his book back up. It would be easier for everyone. The adults in the room looked at each other. Noah turned a page. Easier how? Abigail asked. He looked up with the expression of someone who finds it slightly tedious to explain things that seem obvious to him. Because then I could just say Mom, he said, instead of Abigail all the time, which is, it's fine, but it's longer, and it doesn't say the right thing. The kitchen was very still. He looked between them again. Also, Danny asked me last week what to call you, he said to Abigail, and I didn't know what to tell him. If you were married, it would be Mrs. Rowan, and then everybody would know. He went back to his book. Caleb looked at Abigail. His expression was the specific combination of a man trying not to show how moved he is and doing a partial job of it. Abigail looked at Noah for a long moment. Then she looked at Caleb. He has a point, she said. Her voice was steady. Most of it. Caleb let out a slow breath. Noah, he said. Said Noah, reading. Is that what you want? For Abigail to be your mother? Noah set down the book with the deliberate care of someone who has been interrupted at a critical point and wants you to know it. He looked at his father with the serious, clear-eyed directness he'd inherited from somewhere. She already is, he said. I just want the word to be right. He picked the book back up. Caleb looked at Abigail. She was looking at her hands, which were very still in her lap, and her jaw had the set it got when she was not going to show what she was feeling, which he had learned meant the feeling was large. He reached across the corner of the table and put his hand over hers again, the way he'd done in the kitchen the night of the storm. He's right, Caleb said quietly. The word should be right. She looked up at him. Her eyes were dry, her jaw was steady. And he had learned, over these months, what it cost her to keep those things in place and what it meant that she was keeping them now, which was that the thing she was feeling was large enough that the usual architecture wasn't quite holding. All right, she said, for the second time, in the same quiet tone, the same relief in it, the same weight lifting from a place she'd stopped expecting anything from. Noah turned another page. Outside, January held the ranch in the particular cold silence of a season that had done its worst and was now simply enduring. And inside the kitchen, the fire held, the kettle heated, and a family that had been assembled from grief and necessity and the specific courage of showing up to something uncertain sat at a table together, and the word for what they were was finally, simply, right. The legal matter arrived in February, which was when Caleb had told her things might shift. It arrived in the form of a letter from a land assessor's office in Billings, formal language wrapped around a claim that was anything but, a petition, filed under Bodine's name and one other she didn't recognize, challenging the Eastern Creek tributary rights, and specifically citing Iron Ridge's water usage as part of the contested territory. Caleb read the letter twice at breakfast and handed it to Abigail without speaking. She read it once. She set it down. He moved early, she said. Before spring, Caleb said. Before the community meeting. He knows about the meeting. She looked at the letter again. Someone told him. Ruth Greer's note wasn't private if it went through the postal exchange. Bodine has connections at the Billings assessor's office, Caleb said. That's been known for years. That's how he's kept the tributary question open, not through legal strength, but through access. What does he want? The letter asked for a formal review of usage rights, which means hearings, which means months of process, which means during that process we're restricted in what we can draw from the eastern tributary. He paused. In spring and summer, that's manageable. In a dry year, it's a significant problem. In a very dry year, it could be an existential one. She looked at the letter one more time. Then she folded it and set it on the table in front of her and looked at the middle distance, the way she did when she was calculating. He's not trying to win the water rights, she said. He's trying to make the process expensive enough that we settle. Yes, Caleb said. And if we settle on his terms? We acknowledge his priority claim on the tributary, Caleb said, which gives him leverage over us and every operation below us on the eastern drainage. She was quiet for a moment. Then, who are the other families with tributary access? Dodds, Greer, a smaller family called Anson, 2 miles east of Greer. He paused. All of them would be affected by the priority claim. They might not realize it yet. She looked at him. They need to know, she said. Before Bodine's process moves forward, they need to understand what they're consenting to by not responding. Abigail, this is a legal matter. Getting other families involved gets other families involved in protecting their own water rights, she said, which they have every reason to care about independently of us. She picked up the letter, unfolded it, read the filing date. How long before the formal review period opens? 6 weeks. That's enough time, she said. He looked at her carefully. Enough time for what? To make sure that when Bodine walks into that review, he's not facing Iron Ridge, she said. He's facing the valley. Caleb was quiet for a long moment. He looked at the letter, then at her, and she could see him working through the implications. Not just the practical ones, but the relational ones. The question of what this committed them to and what it required. You're sure? He said. She thought about the Dodds family, the Carver child with the wide eyes watching the wagon unload. Ruth Greer saying that's what made it well done. Margaret standing in the cold outside Holt's house saying, come back in spring. I'm sure, she said. He nodded. He reached for the letter, folded it himself, and put it in his breast pocket. I'll ride to Greer's tomorrow, he said. I'll come with you, she said. I know, he said. He said it not as an acknowledgement, but as a fact of the new order of things. The same way he'd say the sun will come up or the creek runs east. Something established, something relied upon. The specific comfort of a thing that no longer needs to be decided because it has already been decided quietly over months, by the weight of everything that had accumulated since a stagecoach door had opened on a summer afternoon and a woman from Texas had stepped down into a place that didn't want her yet and had decided without announcement that it was going to become hers anyway. She went back to her mending. He went back to his ledger. In the front room, somewhere, a boy named Noah was reading a book, and the house held the particular quality of a place that has stopped waiting for something and has simply become what it was always supposed to be. The ride to the Greer spread took less than an hour on a clear February morning, and Caleb spent most of it quieter than usual, which Abigail had learned to read not as distance but as preparation, the way he gathered himself before conversations that required more than his ordinary reserves. She didn't fill the silence. She'd learned early that filling his silence was a form of taking something from him. Harlan Greer met them in the yard before they'd fully stopped, which meant someone had seen them coming down the road and told him, which meant he'd been watching for visitors in the way of a man who's been thinking about something and waiting for it to arrive. He helped Abigail down from the wagon with the easy courtesy of someone who has revised his first impressions enough times that it no longer costs him anything. Ruth came out behind him, wiping her hands on her apron, and read Caleb's face in about 2 seconds. Come inside, she said. Not a question. Caleb laid the letter on the Greer's kitchen table the same way he'd laid everything difficult on every table over the past 6 months. Without drama, without build-up, just, here's the thing, let's look at it together. Harlan read it standing up. Ruth read it over his shoulder. The kitchen was quiet enough that the stove could be heard. Harlan set the letter down. Bodine, he said. His name's on the petition, Caleb said, along with a land agent named Frick out of Billings. I don't know Frick. I do, Ruth said. She said it flatly, with the specific tone of someone naming a thing they've encountered before and haven't forgotten. He handled the Henderson claim dispute 3 years ago. He's not corrupt exactly. He's just available to whoever pays his retainer. So Bodine's been planning this, Harlan said. Since at least the fall, Abigail said. The filing date is January 21st. He drafted this in December at the latest, probably earlier. Harlan looked at her, while we were all focused on the storm. Yes, she said. The four of them stayed with that for a moment. The particular unpleasantness of realizing that while you were managing a genuine crisis, someone else was managing an opportunity it created. What does he actually want? Ruth asked. Priority claim on the eastern tributary, Caleb said. If the review grants it, he controls water access for every operation that draws from the eastern drainage. Greer, Dodds, Anson, Iron Ridge. Harlan's jaw moved. That's 4 families' futures. 5 if you count the Carvers when they rebuild, Abigail said. And it won't stop with access. Priority claim means he can dictate timing and volume in a dry year. He doesn't have to shut anyone off completely. He just has to make the uncertainty permanent enough that people start making decisions with his goodwill in mind. Ruth looked at the letter. Leverage, she said. Yes, Abigail said. Another silence. Outside, February was doing what it did, cold but no longer savage, the particular held breath quality of a month that knows spring is coming but isn't ready to admit it. What do we do? Harlan asked. He directed the question at both of them, which 6 months ago he would not have done. We respond as a group, Abigail said, not as individual operations protecting individual interests, as families who share the tributary and have equal standing in the review. The petition loses most of its leverage if Bodine has to argue against 5 families with consistent usage records instead of picking us off one at a time. Harlan looked at Caleb. She's right. She generally is, Caleb said, without irony. We need to get to Dodds and Anson before Bodine does, Ruth said. She was already thinking ahead, Abigail could see, reorganizing the problem into tasks the way practical people do when the shock passes. If he reaches them first and frames it as an Iron Ridge problem that doesn't affect them, he'll try, Abigail said. It's the obvious play. Isolate us. Make the others feel like bystanders. Then we ride tomorrow, Harlan said. He looked at his wife. You'll come. Of course I'll come, Ruth said. She said it the way Caleb said I know, as a fact of arrangement, a thing not in question. Abigail recognized the particular ease of a long partnership in that exchange and felt something in her chest that was not envy exactly, but was adjacent to it. The recognition of something she was only now beginning to have, late, and with the particular care of people who have both been burned by carelessness. They reached the Dodds homestead the following afternoon. Joel answered the door with the specific wariness of someone who has recently been through a hard winter and is not yet ready to believe the next problem isn't already at the door. When he saw who it was, he opened the door wider. Margaret came out of the back with the youngest on her hip and read the room in the way of mothers who have learned to assess situations fast, because the alternative is always worse than the assessment. They sat around the Dodds table, Caleb, Abigail, Harlan, Ruth, Joel, Margaret, and Caleb laid the letter down for the second time. Joel read it slowly. Margaret read it over his shoulder, the same way Ruth had read it over Harlan's. There was something almost symmetrical about it. The same gesture in different kitchens, the same weight landing on the same kind of table. Joel set the letter down. He looked at Caleb first, then at Abigail. This affects our water, he said. Yes, Abigail said. Your Eastern Creek feed comes off the same tributary. The priority claim would put Bodine upstream of your draw in every legal sense. Joel looked at his wife. Something passed between them. A conversation that didn't need words because they'd been having its component parts for years. What do we need to do? Margaret asked. Abigail had the answer ready, because she'd spent 2 evenings preparing it. Not a strategy exactly, more a clarity about sequence. Document their usage. Pull the records Joel kept, and she had seen, when she'd visited in the fall, that Joel kept detailed records, better than he probably knew mattered, and formalize them into the specific language a land review board would accept. Do the same for every family. Present the review board not with 5 separate claims, but with a unified record of community water use that predated any of Bodine's maneuvering by years. A lawyer? Joel asked. Eventually, Caleb said. For the filing. But the foundation has to be the facts, and the facts are on our side if we organize them correctly. Joel nodded slowly. He was the kind of man who didn't agree to things quickly, but once he did, didn't waver. Tell me what you need from us. Abigail spent an hour at the Dodds table going through what records Joel had, what format would serve them, what gaps needed to be filled. Margaret sat across from her with a piece of paper and made her own notes. And at a certain point, Abigail realized that Margaret was essentially doing the same thing Abigail had done in August, watching a problem, understanding it, writing down what she understood. The recognition of that parallel did something quiet inside her. You should teach this, Margaret said, not looking up from her notes. I'm teaching it now, Abigail said. More formally, Margaret said. At the spring gathering, not just the preservation methods, this too. How to read a situation. How to prepare for problems you don't know are coming yet. Abigail looked at her. I don't know if I'm the right person to. You're the only person, Margaret said, with the directness of a woman who has stopped having patience for false modesty. You showed up in a place that didn't want you and you made it work. And then you made it work for everyone else too. That's not an accident. That's a skill. People should know what it looks like. The kitchen was quiet for a moment. I'll think about it, Abigail said. Margaret looked at her steadily. Think fast, she said. Spring isn't far. Okay. The review hearing was scheduled for the second week of March, which gave them 5 weeks after the Anson family, a quiet couple named Lars and Britta, who turned out to have records so meticulous they put everyone else's to shame, signed on to the collective response. Gerald Holt's involvement arrived in an unexpected form. He sent a note to Caleb, formal but stripped of the usual social architecture, asking for a meeting. Not at Holt's Cross this time. At Iron Ridge, which was itself a statement. He came on a Thursday morning and sat in the kitchen. Not the front room, the kitchen, which was where everything real happened at Iron Ridge. And he put his hat on the chair beside him, and he said, I want to help with the review. Caleb looked at him carefully. Why? Because Bodine's play, if it succeeds, sets a precedent that doesn't serve this valley, Holt said. Including my operation. I draw from the western tributary, not the eastern, but precedent travels. He paused. And because I've been watching what's happened here since August, and I've been wrong about some things, and I'd rather adjust than not. He wasn't looking at Abigail when he said it, but he didn't not look at her either. It was the closest thing to an acknowledgement she was going to get, and she understood it for what it was. What kind of help? Abigail asked. I know the land assessor's office in Billings better than most, he said. Not through Frick, through the senior assessor, who's been there 20 years and doesn't like his office being used as a venue for leverage plays. I can make a conversation happen that moves this out of Frick's hands. Caleb and Abigail looked at each other. That's significant help, Caleb said. I'm aware, Holt said. What do you want for it? Abigail asked. Directly, because that was how she handled Gerald Holt, and he'd told her once, in his way, that he preferred it. He looked at her. Nothing from you, he said. Nothing from Iron Ridge. He picked up his hat, turned it in his hands. What I want is for this valley to stop being a place where someone like Bodine can hold water over people's heads. That serves everyone, including me. He paused. I can be a man who acts in the community's interest when the community's interest happens to coincide with mine. I won't pretend otherwise. Abigail nodded. That's honest, she said. I try to be, he said, when the cost isn't too high. It wasn't a heroic statement. It was the kind of thing real people say when they're being genuinely accurate about themselves, and she found it more trustworthy than a declaration would have been. All right, Caleb said, make the conversation happen. The hearing lasted 1 day. It was moved from Frick's jurisdiction to a formal panel through a procedural challenge that Holt's contact made possible, and that Caleb and the 4 allied families supported with their documentation. Bodine's petition, which had been constructed to withstand a single-family challenge, was not constructed to withstand a unified response from 5 operations with 20 years of combined water usage records and a senior assessor who had been, as Holt predicted, irritated by the use of his office. Curtis Bodine did not speak much during the hearing. He sat at his side of the room with his attorney and a land agent who was not Frick, and he watched the documentation go into the record with the expression of a man recalculating and not finding better numbers. The panel's ruling came back in 2 weeks. The Eastern Tributary rights were confirmed as shared community access, usage-based, with no priority claim to any single operation. The ruling also included language, dry, formal, the language of legal documents, that effectively closed the category of petition Bodine had filed. It wouldn't prevent him from finding other angles. Men like Bodine always found other angles. But it closed this one, and it did it publicly, in a record that everyone in the valley could read. Caleb came home from the courier's office with the ruling in his hand and found Abigail in the supply room doing the first spring inventory, which was the accounting of what remained after winter and what would need to be rebuilt before fall. He handed her the document. She read it. She read the key section twice. "Holt's contact did good work," she said. "Holt did," Caleb said. "In his way." She handed the document back. She didn't say anything for a moment, just looked at the shelves around her. The organized, labeled, rotated stores that had carried 11 people through a brutal winter and still had reserve to spare. She thought about the note in the margin she'd written in September. Front came early. Move October preparations to now. She thought about how much had happened between that note and this moment. "It's over?" she asked. She meant Bodine specifically. "For now," Caleb said. "I wasn't a man who promised things he couldn't guarantee. He'll be quieter for a while. He lost credibility in the valley, and he knows it. People will remember the Patterson stores and the Dodds firewood longer than they'll remember anything Bodine does," she said. It wasn't wishful thinking. It was the pattern she'd observed over and over in the way communities actually worked. What people felt in their bodies during a hard winter was more durable than what they were told during an easy one. Caleb put the document in his breast pocket. He looked at her in the supply room, surrounded by the shelves she'd organized, the light coming through the patched north wall, and he said, "I want to marry you before the spring gathering." She looked at him. "That's soon." "I know it's soon." "We said spring." "We said spring," he agreed. "I'm saying before the gathering, which is still spring." She looked at him for a moment. He was not a man who pushed things. When he pushed, it meant something. "Why before the gathering?" she asked. "Because at the gathering, you're going to stand up and speak to every family in this valley about how to take care of themselves and each other," he said. "And I want them to know who you are when you do it. Not Miss Mercer, who works at Iron Ridge. Abigail Rowan, who lives here." He paused. "Who belongs here." She held his eyes for a long moment. The supply room was quiet. Outside, the first real thaw was happening. She could hear water moving somewhere, the creek unfrozen, and the sound of it was one of the best sounds she knew. "All right," she said. For the third time. Always the same 2 words. Always the same particular quality of yes. Not swept up, not theatrical, just the clear and certain sound of a person arriving at the exact right place. The wedding was small. That had been her preference, and Caleb's, and Noah's, though Noah expressed his preference by saying only that he hoped it wouldn't take long because he had things to do, which made Danny Pruitt laugh so hard he had to step outside. Ruth Greer stood with Abigail. Walt stood with Caleb. It was a civil ceremony, a justice of the peace from the county seat who arrived on a Tuesday morning and was given breakfast first, which he seemed to consider the most important part of the event. Noah stood between his father and Abigail during the ceremony with the solemn gravity of someone who understands the weight of an occasion without being entirely sure of the protocol. When the justice said the words and the thing was done, Noah looked at Abigail with the direct, unadorned look he'd given her in the barn the first time he'd told her his name. "Mom," he said, testing it. Just the word, said quietly, like he was checking whether it fit. It fit. She put her hand on the top of his head and he let her, which was the most he'd ever let her, which was everything. Walt made a meal that was not his best meal. He said so himself, unilaterally, before anyone could say otherwise, but was made with the particular care of someone who understands that some occasions are not about the food and are entirely about the food at the same time. The ranch hands ate at the long table and were louder than usual in the way of people who are not good at expressing things directly and have found that volume works as a substitute. Grover Marsh, the man who had laughed loudest at the stagecoach stop, who had said, "I'll be damned" over a bowl of soup in a cold room, who had spent 6 months revising his opinion of the world incrementally and without apology, raised a cup at the end of the meal and said, "To Mrs. Rowan." He said it gruffly, the way he said everything, but he said it. The table echoed it back. Danny Pruitt was grinning so widely he looked like a different person. The spring gathering happened on the first Saturday of April, on the Greer property, which was large enough to hold what had become a significant portion of the valley's population. Families Abigail had never met were there alongside the ones she'd ridden to in the coldest part of winter. Gerald Holt came, which surprised some people. He stood at the edge of the gathering with the look of a man who has decided to be present without requiring the center, which was a new look on him and one that sat better. Ruth Greer introduced Abigail. She did it in a few sentences without embellishment because Ruth was not a woman who confused ceremony with substance. She said that Abigail Rowan had spent the winter making sure this valley had fewer crises and more choices, and that was the end of the introduction. Abigail stood at the front of that gathering, in front of families she'd helped and families she hadn't met yet, and families who still had questions about who she was and why they should listen. And she felt the full weight of it. Not stage fright, something more honest than that. The particular exposure of being seen by people who are deciding whether you're worth their trust, and knowing that the only answer to that question is the truth. She was not a natural speaker in the formal sense. She had no training in it, and no pretense of ease she didn't feel. She held her ledger because she needed something in her hands, and she began the way she'd begun everything at Iron Ridge, by looking at the problem directly and saying what she saw. She talked about the North Wall gap and what it had cost in meat before anyone understood why. She talked about the sequence of preparation, not the what, but the when, which was where most plans failed, and she explained why September was October's preparation and why October was November's margin and why the margin was the whole thing. She talked about the difference between managing a crisis and preventing one, which was less a question of resources than of timing and attention. She talked about the Dodds firewood. She didn't make a story of it. She just said, 1 day left, 3 children, and if the preparation had happened in September instead of waiting for signs in November, that family would have had 8 days of margin instead of 1. 8 days was the difference between an emergency and a difficulty, and difficulties were manageable. She heard someone in the back say something to the person beside them, and she heard 8 days in the murmur that followed, and she understood that was the thing that would travel. She talked for 40 minutes. She answered questions for another 30. Some of the questions were practical. How do you calculate volume against duration? How do you manage root vegetable rotation? What do you do about the temperature variance in an uninsulated supply space? And some of them were larger, the kind that come from people who have been thinking about something for longer than the conversation that surfaces it. A woman she didn't know, from a family north of the Halversons, raised her hand near the end and said, "How did you know what to do? Did you learn it somewhere?" Abigail thought about it for a moment. "My father taught me some of it," she said. "I figured out the rest by paying attention and being willing to be wrong." She paused. "I was wrong about things here too, earlier on. I miscalculated a bean ration in my second week and shortchanged the end of the table. I recalculated everything the next day." She looked at the woman. "The answer to how I knew is that I didn't exactly. I paid attention and adjusted. That's the whole of it." The woman nodded. It was clearly not the answer she'd expected. It was clearly the answer she needed. After the gathering, after most families had gone, and the Greer yard had returned to something like its usual self, Abigail stood near the fence line at the edge of the property, looking east. The light was the particular gold of a Montana April afternoon, the kind that makes distance look possible after months of winter making everything feel close and pressed. Caleb came and stood beside her. "How do you feel?" he asked. "Tired," she said. "Good tired." "Ruth said you should do this twice a year." "Ruth is optimistic about my energy." He almost smiled. "Walt says his back is better than it's been in 5 years." "Good," she said. "Danny's asking about a supply management system for the bunkhouse." "Of course he is," she said. "Tell him I'll help him set it up next week." They stood in the late afternoon light, easy in the silence the way they'd become. The way people become when they've spent enough time in the same difficult circumstances that silence stops feeling like absence. "Noah told Grover he's going to teach Rascal to come when he's called," Caleb said. "Is that possible with a steer?" "Apparently Noah thinks so." "Then it probably is," she said. Caleb looked at her. "You always believe him." "He's usually right," she said. "And when he's not, he figures out why and tries differently. He's going to be all right." "He's going to be more than all right," Caleb said. There was something in the way he said it, the particular pride of a man who has watched his child be seen clearly by someone else and has found that it doubles the thing he already felt. She looked out at the east field. Somewhere out of sight, the Eastern Creek tributary ran its usual course, indifferent to the winter's politics, doing what it had done for 1,000 years before any of them had arrived to argue about it. Water moved where the ground directed it. That was the whole of its agenda. "I've been thinking about Margaret's suggestion," she said, "about teaching more formally, not just preparation methods, the whole approach, how to look at a problem before it's a crisis." "And?" "I think she's right," she said. "I think there are women in this valley who are managing things every day that nobody's giving them the language for. And if they had the language, they'd do it better, and fewer families would have bad winters." "You want to do this in addition to everything else?" "Not everything at once," she said. "Slowly, in the way that things actually hold." He looked at her. "In the way that things actually hold," he repeated. That's a good way to put it." "It's how I've done everything," she said. "Nobody's going to trust a system that arrives all at once. It has to accumulate." He nodded. He looked at the same east field, the same late light. "When you came off that stage," he said, "I wasn't there." "I know," she said. "I've thought about that a lot," he said. "What you walked into, without me there. What Hank said." "Don't," she said. It's done. I know it's done. I'm not apologizing again." He was quiet for a moment. I want you to know that I know what it cost. To walk into that and stay anyway." She turned and looked at him. His profile in the afternoon light, still the closed, careful face she'd first seen in the front room, but with more available behind it now. More of the person he'd always been before the years of grief had taught him to manage rather than feel. "It didn't cost as much as you think," she said honestly. "It was hard. The beginning was hard. But I've been underestimated enough times in my life that I've learned how to use it. When people assume you can't do something, they stop watching. And when they stop watching, you can work." He looked at her. "You were working from the first day." "I was working before the stage stopped," she said. Something moved through his face that was the particular quality of a man. Understanding something he wishes he'd understood sooner, and has decided to simply be grateful for understanding now. He put his arm around her, which he'd been doing for 2 months, and which still felt, to her, like something she had to consciously accept rather than expect, a process she supposed would take time and was worth taking time on. She leaned into him slightly. Not dramatically, just the degree that was honest. "I wrote to my brother last week," she said. "Told him what happened. Everything, mostly." "What did you tell him?" "That I came to a place that didn't want me, and I stayed until it did." She paused. "And that it was worth it." Caleb held her slightly closer. "That's the whole story," he said. "That's the whole story," she agreed. Behind them, somewhere across the yard, Noah was explaining to Danny Pruitt with great seriousness and at considerable length the theoretical basis for training a steer to respond to verbal commands. Danny was nodding with the expression of a man who is not convinced but is not willing to bet against this particular child. Walt was somewhere near the food, explaining to one of the Greer farmhands the precise sequence of the bean preparation in a way that made it sound like he'd developed it himself over years of dedicated study, which was not inaccurate in any way that mattered. Ruth Greer was talking to the woman from north of the Halversons, and the woman was writing something down, and Ruth was pointing in the direction of Iron Ridge the way people point at things when they're saying, "That's where to look." The Eastern Creek ran where it had always run. The Montana Spring was doing what Montana Spring does, arriving slowly, without fanfare, in the particular unhurried way of things that are certain of themselves and have no need to announce it. The snow was gone from the lower fields. The upper range still had patches that would last another month. The light was stretching longer every evening, adding minutes to the day the way the ledger added margins, steadily, incrementally, until the difference was no longer a projection, but a fact. Abigail Rowan stood in that light and felt the specific weight of what a person accumulates in 8 months when they choose to stay in a hard place and do the work that's in front of them. Not glory, not recognition, not the clean resolution that stories and books deliver in a final chapter. Just the daily, imperfect, irreplaceable reality of people who need what you have and a place that has become yours, and the quiet, unglamorous truth that belonging is not something that happens to you, but something you build. One cold morning and one honest conversation and one corrected mistake at a time. She had come to Iron Ridge with 2 trunks and a ledger and the particular stubbornness of a woman who had been told her whole life what she wasn't, and she had refused to become the absence of those things. She had become what she was, steadily, in the only way anything real ever happens, without announcement, without a moment anyone could point to and say, "There, that's when it changed." It had changed on all the days. The flour moved across the kitchen, the buckle repaired in the barn, the blue glass washed and returned to the shelf, the soup that made Grover Marsh say, "I'll be damned." The letter answered, the ride made, the notes taken, the question asked and asked again until the answer held. That was the story. That was all of it, and it was enough. And it was the kind of enough that lasts.